Welcome back to another episode of Chatting with CHAP, Ro's Resource Room. I'm Ro, and today I am here with Will Estrada. I've never met him, so I'm equally excited to hear his story and all the things that he's up to. So, Mr. Estrada, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Ro, thank you so much for taking the time. Great to be on with you.
Thank you. So, give me a quick intro about you. I know a lot of times when we ask people to introduce themselves, they start with their titles and their hats. I'm a dad, I'm a mom, I'm this. Tell us a little bit about you, and then you can jump into all your roles, and then please share about your own homeschool story or your homeschool journey.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Kind of going back to the beginning, I grew up in upstate New York, and then when I was 8 years old, my family moved to northern Pennsylvania. So I'm a Pennsylvania homeschool graduate from Bradford County. 20 years ago, I came to Homeschool Legal Defense to start working as a paralegal. I was in law school at the time, so kind of worked my way through the ranks. Met my wife here at Homeschool Legal Defense. The inside joke is HSLDA stands for the Homeschool Love and Dating Association. So met Rachel. We've got two boys, Dominic, age 11, Merrick, 7 tomorrow, actually, who we homeschool in Loudoun County, Virginia. So a little bit about myself. I love doing homeschool work. This is the best job I've ever had. I took 5 years away where I had a bit of grass is greeneritis and became a federal bureaucrat, and then recently came back to homeschool legal defense. And I'm like, this is my passion and what I love doing. I love doing anything outside. We have a 2,500 square foot garden. We have a little farmette in Loudoun County, Virginia. Love hunting, fishing, all that sort of thing. And just great to be on here with you today, bro.
Thank you for being here. I'm always interested when I hear adults who are homeschooled because in my little mind, I think, okay, he must have been a military family. His parents must have been missionaries. It's like a little box of like the people who were homeschooled, but you were also homeschooled. So tell me how did that even get started?
Wow. So I think I'm kind of non-traditional in some ways, at least of the early generation of homeschooling. So my dad's Puerto Rican, grew up in the Bronx. My mom is Italian from Brooklyn, so sort of West Side Story there. I'm the oldest of 8 kids. And dad was a public school educator, spent 37 years as a special ed teacher in the state of New York and Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And my grandparents hated homeschooling. I mean, my parents were certain that they were going to hotline us for child abuse or something. It was really funny though, when I graduated from our homeschool high school program at age 18, you would have thought that my grandparents, it was their idea that we be homeschooled. So we were
Of
all
course.
very academically advanced. Mom had a master's degree in music from SUNY New Paltz. Dad, a master's degree in child psychology. So just very highly educated parents who had a love of learning, and they gave that to all of us as kids as well.
Wow. I'm always so amazed by the public school teachers who say, this is not for my children, because it's really sending a strong message. But what you really share that's also so interesting is the fact that at the end, the grandparents shifted their mindset because that gives hope to some of the families who they're like, oh, we avoid that conversation at get-togethers because, parents are not on board. So there is hope at the end when they see the fruits, sometimes they just don't have the vision, right? Like when God calls us to do something, it's not a conference call. He told us to do it. They weren't in the meeting, so they don't know. But it's great to hear that at the end, they were like, yes, the biggest cheerleader.
They really did. And it's something that I reflect on a lot, Ro, because my parents really had that step in faith of where everyone was against them. My dad's,
Oh,
coworkers, most of our friends at the time, all of the relatives. And my wife and I, neither of us had that. We grew up in Christian households. My wife's also a homeschool graduate from the Commonwealth of Virginia.
oh,
And my parents are strongly supportive of homeschooling. All of my siblings, I believe, are educating their children at home. My wife's
wow.
side of the family, my in-laws sadly passed away, but they were huge fans of homeschooling as well. So we've really had support that I think is very unlike, I know it's unlike what it was growing up with my family, but very unlike too a lot of the people in the early generation of homeschooling. And today, homeschooling is so widely recognized, it's
Hmm.
almost mainstream, bro,
Oh, yeah.
compared to where it was 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, wow. I would actually argue that it is probably pre-pandemic, it was still a little bit, unconventional, but now it's definitely a normal thing. It's you're not getting the same questions as much, like, oh, why? It's like, oh, okay, you too.
You don't, I completely agree. It's fully mainstream after the pandemic. And the test is those of us who were homeschooled as back in the 80s and 90s, we remember the what about socialization question. And you don't get that anymore. Now it's like you tell someone I homeschool and they say, "Oh, that's great. I
Yeah,
know someone who was homeschooled." Whereas back in the old days it was, "Oh, homeschool, you weirdo. Are you even normal?"
right. It's funny you say that because I feel like the question you don't get it as much, but the narrative is still trying to live on. Like there are definitely some people who still think, okay, let's see how that works out for you in terms of socialization. And I've had someone say to me, well, aren't you concerned about socialization? I'm like, yes, that's exactly why I'm homeschooling. I am concerned about socialization, and that's why I pulled them out. So to each his own. And we're doing it. We're excited about doing it. I have three boys myself. They're nine,
Oh,
7,
good.
and 1 year old. So no
Oh
one,
my goodness, you're right in the middle of it all.
we're
So
in the trenches with what they say, right? I'm in the weeds.
yes, good for you, bro. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so we're on here today because CHAP has invited you to be a convention speaker, and I understand you're going to be talking about parental rights and the history of all that. Can you give us a little sneak peek? What should we know about
Oh,
this?
so there's several topics I'll be talking about the CHAP convention.
Yeah,
First of all, if people have never been to the CHAP convention, it is a fantastic event. It's one of the best conferences on the East Coast, actually in the nation, actually in the world.
I love
When
it.
you think of home education, actually, and that's kind of one interesting thing they'll be talking about that we take for granted home education in the United
Mm,
States. In the rest of the world, it is not like it is in the United States at all. First off, there are still many countries where homeschooling is illegal and families are prosecuted, have to flee, jail time, fines for homeschooling. But even in the countries where homeschooling is legal, they don't really have a foundation of protection, either the
mm,
Constitution or court cases or the law. And even in the ones where they do have some sort of protection, those are very, very few. It's just culturally not really accepted. In the
right.
United States, we really sort of have a culture of marching to the beat of your own drum, and that really helps when it comes to homeschooling. So we have it good here in the United States, and I always remind people don't take that for granted.
Mm,
So, in one of my talks where I talk about the history of parental rights, I'll actually be using the framework of a law review article that I recently wrote. It's going to be coming out this summer in Liberty University School of Law and their law review. And I go through the very beginning of the history of first parental rights, but then kind of narrowing down to home education. And Ro, I go back to the beginning. I look at what the scriptures say, both the Christian Bible, Judaism, and the Talmud. I even go back and look at the Quran as well, of where kind of the three great Abrahamic world religions talk about the family and parental rights, and how all three were in alignment, that the family predates government, that the family comes from God, the creator, and that is where our rights come from. Then, second, in this law review and in the talk that I'll be giving at CHAP, I look at the Greek philosophers. Now, they were not monotheistic; they were polytheists. We remember the passage in the book of Acts when the Apostle Paul goes to Athens and he finds and he says, "You guys are so religious. You even have an altar to the unknown God." And that was the Greek philosophers. They were polytheistic, and Plato actually opposed parental rights. He writes in his book, The Republic, that the ideal government, the ideal republic would have these guardians of the republic. And Plato writes, the children would be in common. They wouldn't know their parents. The parents wouldn't know their children. The wives would be in common. Basically, there would be no family structure. And he says this is the ideal. Children with disabilities would be left to die. The rest would be raised by these guardians of the republic and trained to almost be this master race sort of thing. So very dystopian, very, very evil, I would say. And when you think of these debates over parental rights, they're not new. The Greeks had this debate over where family and parents and children should fit in society. Now, the good thing is Aristotle disagreed with Plato. He was actually Plato's student, and Aristotle writes, and again, not a monotheist, he was a polytheist as well, but he says we can go back and look at the animal kingdom of how the animals take care of their young. And this shows us that nature establishes the family before the government and before society as the foundation. And then Plutarch and other Greek philosophers said the same thing. And I kind of go through that history. I love history, bro. If people haven't caught up by now, history and reading were my favorite subjects in homeschooling. One of the reasons I wanted to go into law was I just loved kind of digging into the ancient tomes and these books. So that's the second part I go through in the law review and what I'll be talking about and in one of my talks at CHAP. Then I look at what the English common law philosophers said. And of course, people like Blackstone and John Locke heavily influenced our founders when they were writing both our Declaration and our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And then I say, all right, this is the foundation we had when America was founded. But then why don't we have any court cases dealing with parental rights for the first basically 150 years of our country's existence? And that's because our founders felt very strongly and believed that the Constitution didn't give us our rights. We remember that line in the Declaration of Independence that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our founders, bro, didn't always get it correctly. They had these great things that they believed about human rights, but then our country, when it was founded, we still had slavery. And I always remember what Martin Luther King Jr. Preached once. He was a pastor, and in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, I believe, in Washington, D.C., he said that that was sort of like a promissory note that our founders believed, and that sometimes our country hasn't always lived up to those ideals, and so we're continuing to fight for that growth of justice. But that is what our founders believed, kind of in the universal approach, and that's why parental rights is not in the text of the Constitution. Our founders believed our rights came from God, that we didn't need to codify them all in the Declaration and the Constitution, but that was shared by all of the people in the beginning of our country. And so for the first 150 years or so, the family wasn't really challenged, and that all really began to change in industrialization. Post World War One, there was a lot of xenophobia going on, a lot of anti-Catholic bias, a lot of anti-Jewish bias going on, and laws were starting to be created. The first one was in Nebraska. This was in the early 1920s. A law was passed saying children could not be taught in any language other than English. And there was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska. His name was Robert Meyer. He was teaching a lot of these poor Eastern European immigrants. And one family, there was a young boy. He was 10 years old. He was learning to read from the German Bible, the Martin Luther Bible. And the district attorney, a few days after the law was passed, came in, arrested Robert Meyer for teaching this young boy to read out of the German Bible. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. Robert Meyer was the teacher. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1923 overturned his conviction. This was the first case basically establishing parental rights in our country. It's called Meyer versus Nebraska. And 2 years later, in a much stronger case, in the case of Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the U.S. Supreme Court 9-0 unanimously affirmed that parental rights are a fundamental right. This was a case the Ku Klux Klan had advocated for a law in Oregon which banned private schools. And the U.S. Supreme Court struck that down in Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925. There's a great line. The court said the child is not the mere creature of the state. And since those two cases, Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923, Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925, we've seen a line of Supreme Court precedent that parental rights are fundamental. Wisconsin versus Yoder was 1972. So I'll be going through all those cases in my talk at CHAP, and then kind of bring it home to this one area, one aspect of parental rights, which is home education. And I'll go through the cases from 100 years ago where home education first came up, 1950, and then a line of cases of where homeschoolers actually lost despite these long-standing precedents of parental rights, but then bringing it up to where today, where it's kind of taken for granted that homeschooling is legal. So that's the parental rights talk. Then I've got some other talks kind of going more specifically about the framework, the legal landscape in Pennsylvania. It's important to remember, Pennsylvania is Pennsylvania and New York are the two most highly regulated states for home education. And we've seen a lot of battles in Pennsylvania just in the past year. Pennsylvania is my number one state for contacts of families who have been contacted by the school district for additional regulation and paperwork. And so I'll be talking about some of those cases which we've been dealing with.
So thank you so much for sharing that. You know, when you started talking about the biblical aspects of it, it made me think about the mandate that we have to train up our child and to show them the way they should go. And that we're supposed to talk to in Deuteronomy 6 when it talks about, you know, teach them this and train them this as you go here, when you go there and you go there, like to kind of make it a little bit more modern. When you go to the supermarket, talk to your kids about this. When you're at church, talk about this. And I always joke because I live in New Jersey, but I worked in New York City for 10 years. Um, I lived in the Bronx. I lived everywhere except Staten Island, all the cities. And I always say that I'm a part-time parent. And the reason I say that is because I would drop my babies off at daycare at like 7 o'clock in the morning. I would rush to work for 8:15, leave work at 5 o'clock, pick them up at 6, give them a bath, feed them, read them a story, and send them to bed. I was a part-time parent. So if scripturally it's saying to me, I need to be doing this at this time, at that time, at this time, I can't do that. Someone else has my child for most of the time. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because home education allows us to do this. There's certain character things, whether positive or negative, that I've seen in my children that I wouldn't have seen had I not been home with them. Right? Like my sons will do like the sweetest things. Maybe sometimes I'm with the baby and one will come and say, Mama, do you need some water? Or they'll just bring water and say, Hey, I know you can't move right now because you're trying to put the baby to sleep. Here's some water. If they were in, you know, an institution for a certain amount of time, there's certain things I wouldn't see. And on the flip side, if there are things that I need to work through, that my husband and I need to work on, we get to see those as they interact with their peers, as they interact with each other, we get to see that. So my point in saying all that is it's clear why the institution of the family is under attack. It's clear why there's that narrative or that mindset shift of, yeah, you can teach your baby the colors and the ABC, but once they get to a certain age, like you said, they're meek, a mere creature of the state. Give it back to us so that now we can indoctrinate them.
That is really the truth, Rowan. That's pretty powerful that you've seen that firsthand as a working parent and now homeschooling your kids. You know, when you talk about Deuteronomy 6, those words, those commands are they echo down through history, and we know them well of teach your children about the Lord when you are rising up, when you're laying down, when you're walking, when you're sitting. In Judaism, that is part of what is called the Great Shema. And of course, that passage starts with, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and then it goes on, but that's the foundation of it. And it was really interesting as I was writing this law review, and I'll be sharing some of these quotes when I'm giving this talk at CHAP. But the rabbis, ancient rabbis, have talked about just the primary responsibility of parents to be the ones training up their children, and we see that also throughout Scripture. One of the commentators I talked about in my law review. His name is Matthew Henry. He was a great Protestant theologian of the 1700s. And in 1706, he published his 6-volume Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Bible. And he writes a very detailed commentary on Ephesians chapter 6. And of course, that's where St. Paul is writing about how children obey your parents
Obey
in the
your
Lord, for
parents in the
this is
Lord.
right. Honor your father and mother. And then, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And he just has some great stuff. He's talking about being kind, being gentle to children. Here's one thing, and again, this is from 1706, 318 years ago. He writes, Be not impatient with them. Use no unreasonable severities, and lay no rigid injunctions upon
Mm,
them. When you as a parent caution your children, when you counsel them, when you reprove them, do it in such a manner as not to provoke them to wrath. In all such cases, deal prudently and wisely with them, endeavoring to convince their judgments and to work upon their reason. And it really
mm,
struck me because I'm like, I mentioned how one of our boys is 11, one is going to be 7 tomorrow, and sometimes you get like, why aren't you doing this? And these words kind of echo through Scripture, but through history of parents, love your children, bring them up in the
mm.
nurture and admonition of the Lord. Think of how God is our heavenly Father, and He has just
Right.
infinite patience with us. And I'm like, do I have patience with my kids. But then
Yeah.
as you're talking about, the Christian aspect of home education, Matthew Henry concludes by going on about the importance of raising up our children to know the Lord. And he concludes, let them have a religious education, end quote. And that is so important. There's something interesting because we've seen growth in homeschooling among secular
Mhm.
families, and that's tremendous. I mean, I love to see every parent, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, atheist, being able to educate their children at home. But for us as Christians, and CHAP is a Christian organization as well, it's just so important to remember that's the primary reason why we as Christian home educators are doing it, to be able to show our children the love of God.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so important. One of the other things that I was thinking about when you were sharing what you will talk about is you talked about the turning point. I was going to ask you, like, what was the turning point? Like, why did things change? And you said it was post World War One. I don't want to oversimplify things, but I want you to share more information because for me, like when I think of the pandemic, most companies can honestly say that productivity probably did not fail. It probably improved, right? Because instead of taking an hour lunch, I'm just, eating at my desk. The kitchen is right here. So it wasn't come back to the office because you're being unproductive. It was come back to the office for economy. Starbucks is not doing well because you're at home. The deli right here is closed because you're not coming in to purchase food at lunchtime. Same thing with transportation. If you were to, I don't know if you have this answer, but if you were to just guess or share your opinion, what was it about what was happening with World War One? Why that switch made, or why was that the turning point?
That is a great question, Ro, and I think you're absolutely correct. World War One was a historical seismic shift. And I think in some ways COVID is as well, in just many, many
Mm-hmm.
different ways. So what happened was pre-World War One, America was primarily agrarian. That began to change in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as we saw the factories, people moving from the farm to the city. And that really began to change just a host of issues, how the
Mm-hmm.
family structure was. It used to be the parents were around their kids pretty much all the time. And education was very localized. You would have dame schools. You would have it more affiliated around a church, a lot of homeschooling. We famously remember Abraham Lincoln was primarily homeschooled, actually. So homeschooling is not new, not even in the United States. It's more new when we look at modern history. So you had all that industrialization, and then you had major pushes towards patriotism. And I'm not against patriotism. I'm very patriotic, but there also is, we have to remember that if we're just doing it because, the fatherland or the motherland sort of thing, that's not the right approach. It's, as Christians, it's replacing our relationship with the Lord, where Jesus famously said to Pontius Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, but where it's like everything is for the state. And you even go and look at some of the sermons that were being preached in churches in the run up to World War One. It was very much of, we need to serve the America, blah blah blah, and that's pretty dangerous when you get into that sort of thing where everything is wrapped up in the flag. And so it's kind of that, as Christians, we have that dual thing of, we love our country, but we have to always put God first and foremost. And so a lot of dangerous things, and part of that intense patriotism was anything to do with German language is bad. That's why we saw a lot of states passing these laws banning instruction in any language other than English. But there was also a lot of things that we see even today that were coming back in the early 1900s. A very strong hostility to Catholicism, or to even Christian sects that might not be considered mainstream. That was the intent behind the law in Oregon to ban private education. You had a lot of, I would classify it as racism, with the KKK openly advocating for laws at the state level. Obviously, the KKK is pretty much defeated. It's kind of a shock when we see them around or hear something from them. And so it's kind of amazing that just 100 years ago, they were one of the preeminent lobbying organizations in our country. They were very, very popular. And but really it kind of comes back to this battle of, to whom do children belong, is not new in our country. There's always been those forces of intolerance and hostility to what is good, of saying the children belong to us, put them in one school, the public school, so that they all get the same standardized education. And that's not what our country was founded upon. We were founded on, Pennsylvania, for example, William Penn, someone who spent time in prison because he didn't want to follow the dictates of the crown and instead said, I have to follow the dictates of my conscience. So history, I love history, and you really can see how history repeats itself so often. We always know that line of, those who don't study are doomed to, don't those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it.
Repeat
I
it.
think it's more those who do study history are doomed to watch as everyone else repeats it. So
There you go. Yeah, when you made your comment about patriotism, by no stretch of the imagination did I think you were saying, we're not supposed to be for our country. I hear what you're saying though. Like it made me think back to like separation of church and state. And there's a word that the church that's used to describe the church, and I believe it's a Greek word for ecclesia. And do not start talking about Greek because that's all I know.
Greek. I studied biblical Greek for 10 years, and I can say one sentence in Greek: Doulios Legusi epi or I'm messing it. Doulios Legusi Scorpios epi oikos. The slaves see the scorpion on top of the house. My wife and I honeymooned in Greece, and I did not use that sentence anywhere, and I was disappointed. But ecclesia called out ones.
Right. So, like, the reason I brought it up is because when you think of the church as a government, it's a completely different mindset shift. If you think of your state and that you're committed to the state, then that's how they usurp the authority of the family and the church. So, the only reason I brought it up, I'm like, do not start talking speaking Greek. That's all I know. I know you studied like all the gods
It
and all
went
that
in
stuff.
one ear and out the other ear. So
Yeah, but I really think the idea is how can we take away the power from the family? How can we take away the power from the church and just usurp that authority? A lot of people don't even understand that the church is supposed to be that government system. We just see it as a physical building or at best, a body of people. But the power that we have, like I remember listening to older pastors and they say, yes, I used to be an advisor to the president and I used to be on this leadership team and there was a certain amount of respect for church leaders. Now it's kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna have a pandemic. You can go to Walmart if you want, but you can't go to church. Something is wrong with that picture.
yeah, that is so true. There, and some of it, I think, Ro, is on us. There once was a time
Mm-hmm.
in our country's history where the church would step up to
There you
solve
go.
the social ills. And there's no law saying we can't. It's just, it almost seems like sometimes the churches and the body of Christ have been like, oh, there's a government program for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a government school. There's a welfare program. We're just going to let them take out and handle that. And we'll just preach the gospel on Sunday. And nothing
Right.
wrong with preaching the gospel on Sunday. We need that. But
And
exactly. I mean, that's the whole point of Jesus coming, of, Great Commission: go into all the world
right, of
and
course.
teach the gospel, baptizing them, teaching them to observe all commands whatsoever I have shown you, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. When we are filled with the love of Christ, we will take that out into our communities and help those who are hurting. And that's so important. I mean, we've got to do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because a lot of people, to your point, like when you think of the different spheres of influence or culture, like you think of media, art, and economy, and all of that, there are a lot of Christians who are like, no, no, I'm just Sunday in church. That's it. And I'm like, no, we need you in politics. We need you in business. We need you in places of influence so that you can uphold righteous laws, not hide in. I don't need you to preach to Christians. I need you to go find other people and be light in the darkness, right? Um, so it's really sad that we don't see the power that we have, and sometimes you just kind of cower. Like, I want the Jesus who's flipping tables. Like, that's who we serve, right? It's a righteous
Amen.
indignation.
Yeah, amen. It's interesting you mentioned the spheres of influence too, because that reminds me of it was I think it was John Calvin and some of the Protestant reformers, but they talked about this doctrine of vocation, that you don't have to just be a pastor or a member of the
Mhm.
clergy to make a difference. Wherever you are, whatever God has called you to do, you can make a difference, and you can be used by that, whether you're a homeschool mom. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had a great speech. It's one of my favorite speeches, and whenever I talk to young people, I share it. It was his speech. It's called the street sweeper speech, but he
Yes,
talks about, if you're just a street sweeper, do it for the glory of
be
God. He
the
goes on,
best
he's like,
one. Yep.
yes, yeah, he's like, if you're just a little a little bush on a mountain, be that best little bush that you can. And
Absolutely.
sometimes we forget that. We're like, oh, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer for the kingdom of God. And God uses the tiny things of
Yeah,
the world
absolutely.
for his power. And so, yeah, always encourage people, especially young people, go read that Street Sweeper
Yeah.
speech by Martin Luther King Jr. So,
So I'm curious about something because in my head, whenever I think of New Jersey, I usually put it in the same category with New York and California. Like, okay, California's doing this, Jersey's following suit. New York is doing this, Jersey's following suit. In your research or expertise or history, why is it that New York and Pennsylvania, and I don't want to go too much red and blue, but why is it that New York and Pennsylvania have these harsher laws, whereas California and Jersey don't? I would think it would be New Jersey, California, New York, and Pennsylvania being more lenient. What happened there?
so that is a great question, bro. And I handle numerous states in addition to Pennsylvania. Um, Here's something that's going to probably blow people's minds. Pennsylvania and New York, as you said, have the two strictest homeschool laws. California, Illinois, and New Jersey all have some of the best laws for home education. California, Illinois, and New Jersey are all what we call private school states. There's no homeschool statute. So technically, families are operating as a type of private school.
Hmm.
And that's really the main distinction. In states where families educate their children at home as a private school, it's primarily because there's either been a court case or just a good private school law. For example, in Illinois, and I talk about this in my law review, Illinois in 1950, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that parents educating their children at home were a legal form of complying with the private school law. That's a
Okay.
case called People versus Levison in Illinois. It was a landmark case at the time. So you had families in New York and Pennsylvania going to jail, or in North Dakota, Michigan, going to jail in the 80s, not in Chicago, not in Illinois, because there was this 1950 Supreme Court case from the Illinois Supreme Court. Same in California. It's been primarily, there were some court cases that extended the private school laws, New Jersey as well. And that's really been the distinction. It works. There's never been any serious attempt by the legislatures in those three states to actually draft a quote unquote homeschool statute. If there was, it would probably be far more restrictive. So New York and Pennsylvania, their laws date back to the 1980s. And back then, the laws in Pennsylvania and New York were actually considered very free compared to a lot of the other states. The problem has been we have not been able to get major changes to the laws in Pennsylvania and New York. Pennsylvania has had a recent change in the early 2000s that fixed some things. There used to be, for example, when I was being homeschooled, not only did you have to have an evaluation, but you had to give your physical copy of the portfolio to the local school district superintendent. That's been done away with. It's just the evaluator now who reviews those portfolios. My mom is trying to sell her house. She has pounds of these portfolios because each one was about 3 inches thick and
Right.
basically was almost a photo album
Right.
compendium of everything that we did. You don't need to, you still should have a very strong and detailed portfolio, but you don't have to give that to the superintendent anymore.
When you say give to review or give and never get back.
Give to review. Yes, you
Okay, then
used
they'll
to in
give it back.
Pennsylvania need to have your portfolio reviewed, not just by your evaluator, but
Hmm.
by your superintendent. Now
Oh,
you no
wow.
longer have to have the superintendent be involved in that. The evaluator just sends a 1 or 2 page letter summarizing the evaluation, summarizing the portfolio to the
Mm.
superintendent, and that's sufficient. So it's been a big help, but historically speaking, Pennsylvania's homeschool law is still back in the 1980s when the rest of the country
Mm.
has moved on. When we've, just found and especially talking about COVID and the seismic shift that did both with parental rights and education, we've found that the schools are tragically failing our children when it comes to education. And so it's always disconcerting when I'm wondering, why is the public school reviewing the educational outcomes of the home education kids? They can't even do it for their own children. Something's wrong here. So my hope is that down the road, we'll be able to get some common sense freedom into Pennsylvania's home education law, but I don't think that's in the cards anytime soon, just politically.
Understood. Thank you so much for sharing. That makes sense. I did not realize that I was deemed a private school, and that's why, like, leave me alone.
Technically, New Jersey is a private school state,
Oh,
so you have great freedom in New Jersey. So don't move to Pennsylvania.
got it. Note to self. Thank you so much. You have been a wealth of information. Do you have any final thoughts or anything else you'd like to share with us?
Absolutely. So I'll also be talking about some of the trends we're seeing in Pennsylvania. I have a workshop about complying with the home education law. One of the
Good.
biggest things we've seen in Pennsylvania is, and this is something that came from the pandemic, is a demand for evidence of immunizations, evidence of
Mm,
medical and dental visits. And we've been very aggressive in working on this. Back in my day when I was being homeschooled in Bradford County, the school districts never asked for that information. That's all post-COVID, where the federal government, Health and Human Services, is asking the Pennsylvania Department of
mm,
Education, which in turn is asking the Pennsylvania Department of Education, which in turn is asking all 500 school districts in Pennsylvania to essentially be the immunization cops on home
wow.
education families. So I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about some of the other trends we've seen of demands for additional information from school districts to home education families. There'll be other great speakers at this year's CHAP convention, so I look forward to meeting you in person at that conference.
Same here. Thank you so much. So when you shared about like what's happening and how you're attacking it aggressively, would it be helpful for families to write letters? Like, do you have these kind of action alerts that people can sign up for? Like, what moves the needle?
Absolutely.
Bombarding
So,
them?
yeah, absolutely. So, at its core, and I'll kind of give a bit of a behind the scenes here.
Okay.
This is a gray area of the law. The home
Hmm.
education law does have language about evidence of immunizations. The big question has been, is that notarized affidavit or unsworn declaration, is that considered adequate evidence? And a court has never weighed in on that. So we're giving personalized legal advice to every single HSLDA member family who receives a letter or phone call. So I encourage people, if you live in Pennsylvania, join HSLDA. This is not going away. It's increasing the
Hmm.
persistence from the school districts. And so in order to best serve you, you need to be a member of HSLDA. You can also, if you don't want to join, you also can find out information from our emails, but we're being pretty circumspect on what we're sending out because this is a legal issue and an ongoing legal issue. It could
Yeah.
end up in the courts. So we're at this point on the immunization, medical, dental. We're just serving HSLDA member families on that. And since there has been no court case, there's really no, well, here's what the courts have said, so here's the
Right.
definitive answer. So it's very much case by
Case
case,
by
what school
case.
district you live in, what your own family's intent is to do. Are you a religious family?
Hmm.
Do you have a moral or philosophical objection to immunizations? Do you have no objection to immunizations,
Right.
but
Or
just don't want
medical
to give the
reason not
school
to.
district
Yeah.
that? Yep. There's also medical demands for medical information. There's also demands for dental information. I mean, this is why Pennsylvania is kind of behind the times
Yeah.
here.
It's pretty
Um,
intrusive.
it's very intrusive. And a lot of families, particularly post-COVID, are just like, I've got a great doctor. I love my kids. Why do I have to give this information to the school district? And
Right.
so would encourage people to join HSLDA. If you decide to wait until the conference, the CHAP conference, we'll have a very good discount there for attendees at the CHAP conference. So you can get that information there, or of course, you can go to hslda.org and sign up for our emails or join there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. If there's anyone who's listening who has not purchased your ticket, what are you waiting for? Go onto the CHAP website and secure your ticket so that you can stay abreast of all this information. Mr. Estrada, thank you so much for your time today.
Ro, thank you for all that you're doing. It's a privilege to be on and look forward to seeing you at the convention.
Thank you.